Hello and welcome to this section on the basic UI elements and Xamarin Designer. As you can see from the image on screen, we've got a fair few things to go through, and all of these are standard iOS controls. We're going to look at toggle switches, which are the green switches that currently says random color on. We'll look at sliders. We're going to implement a slider that allows us to dynamically change the size of text inside of a text view. Then we'll take a look at progress bars. Progress bars are a way of giving feedback to your user as to the progress of an event, like a download or some kind of processing event. Then I'm going to set you a task of changing the background color to a much lighter hue so it doesn't conflict with all of the elements we have on screen. And as a bonus in this lecture, I'm going to walk you through threading, in particular correct threading for UI elements. You'll discover that you cannot run any UI updates or access inside a background thread, which will create problems for you in the future, but I show you how to get around this by using the invoke on main thread method. Toggle switches. They're a very iOS feature. So let's look at adding one to our current app. Open up your main storyboard. Over in your toolbox, type toggle, or if that doesn't come up, type switch. And if we click on switch, down here you'll notice this is called a UI switch. Drag one over to your project and then we're going to position this just under our enter sentence label. In fact, let's give it a little room by pinning it to the side, giving it a value of, let's see, 10, and then let's pin it to the label above, and let's give that a spacing of, hang on, Xamarin's just doing funny things this morning, give it a spacing of about 20. Once you've done that, we're going to put a little label next to it that tells the user exactly what they need to use this switch for. So let's drop in a label from our toolbox and pop it next to the switch. Let's double click this, and what are we going to use this switch for? Let's have random color on. Then let's increase the size, and you can do it when we have these circular icons set as on. There we go, and then click it once more and let's pin this over to the side of our switch. We want this nice and close so the user knows what to do with it. And let's drop this to about, I believe, let's try 10. Right, so I've got our switch and our label, and I actually want to move this up a little. Let's move everything about to its location. So click the switch, click the update frames button, and the same with the label. So we can get everything lined up nicely. Let's have this at 10, maybe bump it up a little. There we go. That kind of fits now and seems tied to that label. Right, let's click the switch And of course we have to give it a name so we can reference it inside of our code. So let's just call this switch with a lowercase s. In fact, that's a bad name because in C# you have statements called switch case statements or case switch statements, and switch is a keyword that it uses. So let's have this named color switch, so there's no clash of words here. Right, so save that. We now have a reference to our color switch. What are we going to do with it? Well, let's open up our viewcontroller.cs, and seeing as we've called it a color switch, what we want to do is when it's on, we want to toggle the background color like we did in the previous section. When it's off, we want to leave the background color as it is. So inside of our button touch up inside is where we're going to take care of that. Just above the code to change color, we're going to perform a check to see whether the switch is on or not. So type if color switch dot on. So this tests whether the switch is on or off. Open our curly braces, and if the switch is on, we're going to surround this random color function with some Boolean testing to see if our switch is on. Right, so hit play, and hopefully this will work when we run it in our simulator. So when we have the switch on, we get a background color change when we click transport, and we do. If we switch the switch off and hit transport, there is no change of color. Now this isn't obviously the only way to use the UI switch in iOS. I'll just stop that running. There are several other ways to do it. One of which we can put inside of viewDidLoad. Let's have color switch dot, and then let's scroll down the list and look for the E icon, which tells us about an event that happens to the switch. So we've got editing. What else do we have? We also had some touch-up insides, which is sort of similar to how buttons work. So if I start scrolling down here, we've got a touch, drag, touch down, etc., etc. We've also got this one that I use most often, and its value changed. So let's have a plus equals for that, and scroll down and set our color switch value changed method, and this will fire it up for us. So if our switch has been changed, I think what we'd like to do is change the label color, or not the label color, the label text, to let us know that the switch is currently deactivated or activated. So first of all, go to your main storyboard and let's click the random color on label and let's give it a name. So let's have this as switch label. Save that, and now inside of here we should have access to our switch label. Then let's say if our color switch dot is on, then what I'd like to do is set my switch label dot text equal to, let's call this deactivate color. Then we're going to have an else, so if the switch is off, we will have the switch label dot text equal to activate color. Right, so now this is going to fire off every time the switch is toggled, which means our label text should also change with that toggle. And this is all part of good user experience. You need to tell your user explicitly what is going on. If you click it off, it says activate color, deactivate color. So I can click transport as much as I like, nothing happens. I can activate it, and transport does its business. Okay, that sums up how to use a UI switch. And it's quite a handy control to have because it's used everywhere inside of the default iOS apps like settings, so users recognize it and know how to interact with it. So we have our app, we have some random color functions that we can shove in there, but what if we've got some text in here and I hit transport and it's put in this box? What if that text is too small for our user to read? Well, on iOS they can set this in system settings, the default text size, and you'd do well to actually look into that. But we can also give them a helping hand by allowing them to change the size of this text. And how are we going to do that? We're going to make what's called a slider. A slider is a control that you can slide from 0 to 1, and then you can use the associated values to change something. So let's head on over to Xamarin, open up our main storyboard. Inside of the toolbox, let's search for slider, and let's drag one in. And what I'm going to do with this slider is, first of all, give it a name. Let's call this text size slider. Then I'm going to position it on top of my text at the bottom here. So I'm going to drag my pins down. I'm also going to give this a width. Let me just zoom in a little. Let's drag it out. And what we can do is have this slider pinned to the sides of our screen. So let's make these values something like 100, because we don't want it to take quite the whole screen. Okay, that should be sorted now, so we have a full slider. Now if I select the slider and I scroll down in the properties box, we can set values for the minimum, maximum and the default when it is first loaded. So these values are completely up to you. Obviously we can turn them up or turn them down. It depends on what you need. So what do we need? Well, we're going to use this slider to change the text size of this text box. And if I scroll down here, you'll notice we have a font size of 14 points as it's currently set. So what I would like to do with the slider is change these values to a current of 14, and let's have a minimum of 5 and perhaps a maximum of 22. So these values are going to correspond to the text font size we're going to apply to this box when we slide the slider. Just of note, we have some images that we can use for minimum and maximum. We can have some track tints when we're minimum and max. So for example, if we're max, a typical track tint would be red. And the minimum, maybe we would make that green. And you can also have a tint for the thumb, which is the little circle that we see there, so I'll make that brown. Okay, save that storyboard, head over to your view controller, and we should now have a reference to that slider. Okay, so how do we get the values out of a slider? Well, first we have to have an event. So inside of our view did load, we need to reference our text size slider dot, and we need to find the event that corresponds to what we need. So I'm betting it's something like value changed. Let's have a plus equals, and let's make a method stub for it. Text slider value changed. So inside of here, we want to actually grab the value of our text size slider. So let's have var value is equal to text size slider dot value. And you'll notice this returns a float. That may be important later on, or it may not. It depends what we're doing with the value. Now we need to assign that value to the font size of that text view. So text view dot font is equal to UI font dot. Now we could actually set our own font here from name, and this asks for a font name, so we could have something like Helvetica if we wished. But this is a bad design pattern, so I'm just warning you against it now. If you hard code these values in, later on in other iOS systems, Helvetica might not be there, or you might want to use the system font. So it's a much better way to use the UI font dot system font of size. And what this does is grab the default system font for the current version of iOS this is running on, and then apply a size to it only. So inside of the arguments we want to pass over our value, and we are ready to go. So let's hit play, and when this runs, we grab our slider. Every time we move that slider, the value changes, and it reports back to the text view and changes the font size. And there we have our lovely scaling font before our eyes. Now, one other thing about the text view that I'd never mentioned before is that by default it allows scrolling. So you can make this as big as you like and then allow your user to scroll through it. Okay, that sums up how to use a slider. Typically, if you're making a media app, you would use the slider to adjust volume, brightness, something like that. You could also use a slider to mark progress in something, but there's a better element for that, and that is to use a progress bar, which we're going to cover in the next lecture. So far we have an app that allows us to change text sizes, transport sentences, and change random colors of backgrounds. We're going to add one more element to this, and this is the progress bar. We're going to do something very cool with it. We're going to have things typed into this box. When we hit transport, it's going to remove the items one by one and transport them down to this text view at the bottom that we can adjust currently. But whilst it does that, it's going to inform a progress bar of our current progress. So it's going to slowly edge across the screen the more numbers have been processed. Where else would you want to use a progress bar? Well, if you were playing media, you would want to know where you were in the media, and the progress bar is absolutely ideal for that. So, head on over to Xamarin, click your main storyboard. Inside of your toolbox, grab a progress view and drop it in. Now I'm going to place this somewhere near the top of my screen, just underneath the random color on switch. And I'm going to make this the full width, so I'm going to start pinning it. I'm going to have this as 0 because I want this to go all the way to the edge. and I want to pin it to the bottom of this switch. So as it is, I think we will leave it. Right, if we click the progress view, let's look at some of the properties that this has. So first of all, let's give it a name, progress view. It has a default style currently, but we can set it as a bar, and I think we'll have it as a bar. The progress goes from 0 to 1 currently as a default, and that's why our progress here is currently set at 0.5. If I drop this down a bit, you'd see the bar change. So we're going to have a little bit of maths going on with our progress bar to scale our values of whatever we're doing to between 0 and 1. So I'm going to put this at 0 for now. You can also have a progress hint, a track hint. You can change the colors wherever you like. I'm going to leave them as default for now. Right, so save that, and inside of View Controller we should have our progress view available. So where do we want to actually do something with this progress? Well, that's going to happen when we click the Transport button. And that event is this button touch up inside. So inside of here, we need a function that first of all takes letters one by one from the bar at the top and drops them into the text view. So we're going to replace this section here with another function. So I'm just going to delete that, and underneath of resign first responder, because we want the responder to go away first, I'm going to reference a function that I haven't made yet. Let's call this transport text. And then underneath, let's create it, void transport text. And we are ready to go. So we want to grab these items one by one. How do we do that? Well, there's a simple solution. We're going to use a while loop. Let's have while. And what a while loop does is it executes a block of code while a certain condition is true or not true. So while our text field dot text is not equal to blank, so that's 2 inverted commas, then we're going to grab the last bit of text from it, or the first bit, and transfer it to the text view. So first of all, up above, we need to clear our text view dot text because we don't want to add what's already there. Then while our text field dot text is not equal to that, we're going to grab the first character from it. So var letter is equal to text field dot text dot, and we want a special method called substring. And substring allows us to grab a certain part of the string. So we want the one at 0. And how long should this be? Well, only one character. So now we have the first letter that's inside of our box. Let's add it to our text view. So text view dot text is equal to the text view dot text plus, and that's because we want to keep the text that we already have in there from previous runs of this while loop, and we just want to add the current letter. So plus letter. So that should add them one by one. Now we need to remove the letter from the first part of our text field, because if we don't, then we'll never reach this condition where the text field is empty, and this will stay stuck in the while loop and our app will crash eventually. So let's have text field dot text is equal to the text field dot text dot substring, and we're going to take this from start index of 1. So we're skipping the first one, which is indexed at 0, and we're going straight to the first one. If we only have one argument, it'll take the rest of the string after that point. Okay, let's go ahead and test this. So hit play on our simulator. And I have a feeling I know what's going to happen here. And I'm going to show you what I mean in a second. If I typed in some text and I hit transport, bang, everything gets transferred. Almost immediately. Well, it probably took a millionth of a second, but to us that's immediate. So what we need inside of this function is some way of slowly adding these letters to the view below. We need a kind of timer, a stopwatch, a delay, something like that. So we're going to modify this method to be asynchronous, and we do that by typing the async keyword. This means it runs in concert with other methods but doesn't block them. Now this is important, and I'll show why in a second. Inside of our while loop, we want to start what's called a new task. And a task is simply a way of grabbing a bunch of code and running it on a different thread than the thread that is currently running the user interface. In mobile app design, we never want to block the UI thread with a long-running task. That's why we use background threads. Await task dot factory dot start new, open 2 brackets, close 1 bracket, equals, triangular bracket, and open brace. Now what this line does is start that new task for us. Right-click task, hit resolve, and go to use threading.tasks because we need to include it. So once we have that, let's indent this text, and then let's close off that task factory. Let's have curly brace, normal bracket, semicolon. On the line below, type await task.delay. And this allows us to specify a delay. And this is the crux of why we're running this on a background task, because if we implement a delay, we don't want the user to notice that when they're trying to interact with the screen. If you delayed on the main thread, the user wouldn't be able to touch anything, click anything, or do anything on the main screen. So that is why this is all running in the background. Let's have a 500 millisecond delay, which is equivalent to half a second. Right, so what this is going to do is, while the text field is not empty, it's going to start a new task, do all of our business with transporting letters, and then it's going to wait for half a second and then continue after that half a second. Let's run this on our simulator, and I can guarantee we are going to get a horrible crash. And again, this is to do with threads, and it's something that catches a lot of people out. So let's enter our sentence and hit transport. And bang, something has broken. Our error message is a UIKit consistency error. You're calling a UIKit method that can only be invoked from the UI thread. So what does that mean? Well, come back to your view controller. These 3 items here need to be executed on the UI thread because they are part of the UI. And what we've just done is run them inside of a background thread. So you cannot do that on iOS or things will crash. We need to transfer these commands to the front-facing thread. To do that, we use invoke on main thread. Open two brackets, close one, equals triangular bracket, and open our curly brace. Now anything that runs inside of this invoke on main thread, it will run on the main thread. Now let's hit play, and hopefully our app will not crash this time because it is now correctly threaded. So let me put my sentence in and hit transport, and look at that. The letters slowly transport over one by one after half a second of delay. So stop that running. The final piece of the puzzle, of course, is the main title of this lecture, and that is how to update our progress bar. Well, obviously we have to do this on the main thread. So somewhere inside of here, we're going to update that value. Let's create a new method called update progress view. Then down below, let's create it. Void update progress view. Now, be careful here, because this catches a lot of people out again. If we're running a method from an invoke on main thread, that implies that the whole method will run on the main thread. And that is true. So always take that into consideration, that just because you have a method doesn't necessarily mean it's going to run on the main thread or a background thread. You have to explicitly look at what is surrounding it to see where it's going to run. Let's create our update progress view. The first thing we need is to get the overall length of the text. So let's have var text length is equal to, and we're going to grab the text from the text field, dot text. We're going to check its length by using the length property, which you'll notice is an integer. And we're going to add the text view dot text dot length to that. So at the moment, text length will be an integer. And if you remember, our little pattern is to take the text one by one and transfer it to the other, so the total amount of text will always be the same if we add them together. Now these integers are going to be a problem, because later on we're going to start dividing things to work out ratios for our progress view. And when we do division, we definitely want floats or doubles. So I have to cast this text length to a float, and the way we do that is by opening brackets, float, and then put this little addition in its own brackets. Now if I hover over text length, it'll grab a float for us. Now we need another variable called transfer progress, and this is going to divide the number of letters that have transferred to our text view by the total number of letters. So equal to text view dot text dot length divided by the text length. Now this should be interesting for us. We have a dot length here, which is an integer, and we're dividing it by a float. So how does that come out in the answer? Well, transfer progress, let's see if we hover, becomes a float. So if you like, it's taking the highest common denominator of the different types that are in here. And be careful with mixing types, because it can have unexpected results. Right, now we just need to assign that transfer progress to our progress view dot progress is equal to transfer progress. Now we should see our bar slowly snake across the screen when we run this. Let's enter ground and hit transport. And there we have it. We have loads happening on this screen. So let me enter a much bigger one and hit transport. And now we can see it a little more clearly. Isn't that great? We now have a little bit of a kind of animation to our app. And it's things like this that really please users. I know at the moment there's a massive clash of colours and everything's kind of higgledy-piggledy, but when you make your apps, you now have the tools to inform your user as to what's happening in the background. Here's a little task for you guys. The first task is, when we hit this transport button, sometimes we get a colour that really clashes with the elements we have on screen, and it almost makes them appear invisible. So your first task is to modify this colour changing function so that it doesn't quite clash with these background elements. Then the next task I want you to do is a rather epileptic task. I want you to change the background colour every time a letter is transferred. So not just at the start, I want it to happen every time a letter gets transferred below. In the next lecture, I will walk you through a solution, but please have a go at it by yourself first. Okay, welcome to the solution to your task. The first task was to change this background color to a much lighter color every time we clicked transport. Head on over to Xamarin, open up your view controller, and we're going to look at this button touch up inside, and in particular this if color switch is on. Now if you recall, when we set a random number and then we requested a next double, this gave us a value between 0 and 1. We then used that value to make a color from RGB which accepts red, green and blue values between 0 and 1. Now the higher the value, so the closer to 1 you are, the lighter the color will be. It's sort of counterintuitive, at least to me. So what we want to do is actually change these random numbers to be closer to the 1 section. So if they come out at 0, we'd actually like to have them not be there. We want them to be, say, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, something like that. The first port of call is to look at this next double. If I open the bracket, the autosuggest gives me some methods or arguments I could have in here, and for next double there is only 1 because it's 1 of 1. I can only get between 0 and 1. I could take that value and multiply it by 2, but I might have an error. I might go beyond 1, which might cause crashes later on. So what I'm going to do is replace this next double with a next integer. And if I scroll through my list of available arguments, I can set a min value and a max value for this integer. Now that's handy. Let's do that. Let's set a minimum of 50 and a maximum of 100. Now why 50 and 100? Well, because this is an integer, I can't say 0.5 and 1 because that's a decimal point. And later on, what I'm going to do is actually divide this round 1 by 100. So down here in my background color, I can say divided by 100, or I can do it up top here, divided by 100. Now it depends again on the variable types, because we have a float cast here. We have to be very careful with where we do this. So I think I will actually put it down here by round 1. And then we're going to do the same for all of the other numbers. So this is going to give us a random number. Let's say it chooses 69. Divided by 100 is 0.69. So our value will always lie between 0 and 1. Now if I hit play, let's see what it looks like. We should have much less of a clash with the background color that appears. So there we go. We can click through it and you'll notice we have nice light sort of palette going on here. Okay, so that solves that problem. The other one was we wanted to change the background color every time a letter was transferred, not only when we clicked the button. To do that, let's make this change color function a function all of its own. Let's cut it and tidy up a bit here, and then void change background color and drop it into here. Right, so we have our change background color. Now, because we have this method, which I obviously can't spell, there we go, we want to call this method every time we transport our text, and we also want to make sure it runs on the main thread. So after update progress view, let's have change background color. Now let's hit play, and we should have this epilepsy effect. This app is really getting out of hand, isn't it? And when I put my text in and hit transport, I get a different color each time it transports my text. And if we really want to have a rave, we can drop this task delay down to about 100, so it's going to run 10 times every second, and we should get a nice flashing screen. If you've got epilepsy, I'd advise you to actually look away now, because this might trigger it. When I hit transport, I get a whole bunch of different colors. It's actually kind of cool, and I think with a bit of tweaking, you could have something like this in one of your apps that would make your users go, wow, I really like how he's done that. Okay, so that is the final lecture in this section. In subsequent sections, we're going to start afresh with new apps and new ideas. Alright, well done guys, you've reached the end of this section. This is just a little refresher so it sticks in your head all of the lessons you've learnt. You've learnt how to use toggle switches and to query their state whether they're on or off. You also learnt how to manipulate sliders, and in our example we used the slider to manipulate the size of text inside our text view dynamically. Then we had a look at progress bars. We discovered that progress bars are a very good way of informing your user that a process is currently happening, and it implies that they should be patient and wait for it to finish. Then I set you a task which was to change the background color to a light hue so it doesn't conflict with our elements. I also wanted you to change the background color with every letter that got transferred from the enter sentence box down to the text view. And finally, and perhaps one of the more important things in this lesson, is the correct threading practice for updating UI elements. You always want to update your UI elements on the main thread, and in Xamarin that is called by typing invoke on main thread. That concludes this section on the basic UI and Xamarin Designer.